because Justice Alliance realised the point of setting up Justice Alliance by a number of people is that we did not want the campaign to save legal aid to be solely in the hands of lawyers, legal practitioners. Not only would it look awful, but it was actually completely wrong. The point about saving legal aid is not to save lawyers' jobs, nice though that might be for some of us, it's actually about access to justice for all those people who cannot afford to pay lawyers. And so the Justice Alliance is a broad organisation that comprises not just lawyers' groups, but National Association of Probation Officers, various other NGOs, inquests and so forth, and all of those campaigning groups coming together in order to work together to save legal aid. Matt's efforts as one of the founders of Justice Alliance and one of the real dynamic forces behind the campaign to save legal aid was recognised a few months ago when he received the award of Legal Aid Champion, he's going to blush now, Legal Aid Champion from the Legal Aid Lawyer of the Year's Award. Very prestigious award. In fact, he's the very first Legal Aid Champion. I'm going to hand over to him to talk to you about the campaign to save legal aid. He will talk for about 20-30 minutes, something like that, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Liz. It's 65 years since the 1949 Act came in, which set up the legal aid system that we have today, a proper national system. It followed the NHS, education and housing, and set up the same principles, exactly the same principles that we had in those areas. And it's summed up in the introduction that Hartley Shawcross gave to the Act, that it would open the door of the court freely to all persons who may wish to avail themselves of British justice without regard to the question of their wealth or ability to pay. So that really set up two principles, opening the door of the courts freely to all persons who need it, and putting to one side whether they can afford it or not. And it's those two principles that are the antithesis of those two principles is the two recent ministers of injustice, if we call them that. And people's memories is that Kenneth Clarke was a nice, soft, cuddly person who wore loafers and was sort of on our side. And it's easy to think that when we think of Chris Grayling. But in fact, it was Kenneth Clarke that introduced the LASPO reforms. They never call these things what they actually are. They never say the LASPO cuts, which is actually what they were, the LASPO decimation. They call it the reforms, in keeping with the government that they followed. We now know what the LASPO reforms meant, and people campaigned about this at the time. It was a fairly decent campaign involving the Law Society, Legal Action Group, unions, saying this will take away access to justice for all sorts of people, vulnerable people who need it in society. And they were ignored. The position is far worse than anybody could have imagined in that campaign. And I'll read you a series of statistics that have come out in the last 2 months. In civil law, there's been an 80% drop in cases seeking purely legal advice since 2009. There's been a 30% fall in legal aid certificates for court. The number of lawyers providing civil law advice since 2007 has halved. Family cases have experienced a 60% drop. So we now see the effect of that in family court, where people are unrepresented, the couples from either side, and it completely contradicts the policy of the government, is mediation to try and resolve these things without going to court, but without the professional independent advice, or having all sorts of unrepresented people in court, having to argue out these cases in a miserable way, which is very costly for the court, but also for the individuals, and particularly for the children involved. The number of people granted legal aid in housing has pretty much halved. In debt cases, it's gone down from 80,000 to 2,000. In mental health cases, 42,000 to around 500. And in employment cases, 16,000 to 18 people got legal advice in employment cases. So this really is a recipe there's a bully's charter for the bullying employer, the Rackman landlord, the unresolved problems amongst families. This is what this is the charter for, and that's what Kenneth Clark brought in, and we have all the evidence now. Rights of Women, which is a wonderful small organisation, the director is a friend of mine. I started out with her. They took a judicial review. They challenged an aspect of these reforms just the other day, and they got permission from the court with a lovely demonstration outside. And I just want to read a couple of cases that they took to the court. These are the sort of people who now no longer have access to the court. The doors of the court are firmly shut in their face. A young teenage mother came to see me as her baby had been snatched by its father. The police took the view that the child was not at risk, but in addition, they felt unable to intervene as the father had parental responsibility. There had been a history of domestic abuse perpetrated against the mother, but the mother did not meet any of the gateway evidence criteria, as in LASPO, and this vulnerable young woman required an emergency residence order and prohibited steps order. I was unable to assist her any further without legal aid. She was extremely distressed. In a second case, I had a case where a mother had a child removed from her and the father applied for a residence order on an urgent basis, alleging that she had a drinking problem. Social services had become involved following the allegations from the father. The mother was unable to obtain legal aid to represent herself as she did not yet have the evidence and would not have satisfied the evidence criteria they set up, despite there being a history again of domestic violence. The father was better off financially and he was able to pay for representation. So those are the sort of cases that have been set up by NASPO. So rather than waiting for all of that to come through, Grayling jumped the gun as soon as he came in to office. And he wasn't reforming things, he was transforming things for the better. Four main areas of attacks on legal aid. I'm afraid I've got to go through them. They're a bit listed, but we do need to know what's happened. The first is to take away legal aid for prisoners who need to complain. And that means they have to rely on the prison complaint system. Anybody who's had any dealings with that knows that that is a complete disaster. You're having to rely on the very people you're complaining about to resolve the complaint. And what's followed that was the first cut he made, was a series of very, very pernicious attacks upon prisoners, denying them books, turning off, having a lights out policy, massive cuts in the prison. So there's very, very massive cuts in association. And you have a bubbling under. And there are all sorts of incidents going on in prisons, which are really mini riots, but because some of these prisons are owned now by private companies, they call them incidents or whatever. And all of this is being hidden from us because people are being denied access to the outside world. That's cut number one, which has come in. People are trying to challenge it still, but it's come in. The second cut is to deny, again, one of the most vulnerable groups in society, deny them access to legal aid. People who can't prove their residence here for 12 months. They don't have rights anymore to civil legal aid. And that would include people at Yarlswood who are alleging sexual abuse by the prison there. They wouldn't have access to legal aid if that cut came through. I'm pleased to say that the court throughout this said this was unlawful in quite a very, very strong terms for a court. Said that Grayling was playing up to the right-wing press and said that it was unlawful. But Grayling, in his style, his particular style, is carrying on challenging that to the Court of Appeal. The third area is on an attack on a fundamental right to challenge unlawfulness altogether, an attack on JR, saying that lawyers shouldn't be paid if they've done work on the case, if they don't get permission which means that lawyers can't sort of do the work in the first place because they can't take the risk of all the work that's involved before that stage. It's a fundamental attack on JR, and it's not surprising that Graham would go for that, because he's facing a series of judicial reviews himself for acting unlawfully. And he talks about, when he writes in the Daily Mail, about really attacking the rights of left-wingers, really, to bring judicial reviews. He's quite open about it. And we'll wait to see how that goes. I'm hopeful that the court will strike that one out, but we'll have to wait and see. The fourth area is in my area, which I deal with, is sort of criminal defence. And initially they said you didn't have a right to choose your own solicitor. You have to have one of these state-appointed solicitors who have got to be big and uncaring and do as little work on your case as possible. That was really the criteria. If they could bid to do the work at the least amount of money, they were good enough for you. And if they were called Eddie Stobart and they were specialised in lorries, it doesn't matter at all, as long as they can offer the cheapest bid. Now, thankfully, we won the right to choose, but in its place is really a denial of a proper choice, because they're setting up a system where these big factory firms would take over duty work, and in time the small and medium-sized firms that, in my experience, the places I've worked, usually the more caring places and usually do the more specialist work would be removed. So that's an area that we're fighting for, and I'm pleased to say that recently we had a judicial review that showed that process of when they brought this system of how many firms there should be in big factory firms, they didn't disclose the two economic reports on which it was based, and the court said that was completely illegal. And now, I'm in an extraordinary position, the new consultation, that one of the people who've written one of those reports is responding to the new consultation to say that, essentially saying that he doesn't agree with the whole process, which is an extraordinary position for the government to get themselves into all this. So now, what is the justification for all these terrible attacks on our fundamental rights? And they say we cannot afford legal aid anymore. That the world is coming to an end if we spend any more money on legal aid. We have to bear down on legal aid costs in this period of austerity where we all have to muck in together. I mean, to be honest, the hypocrisy of it, I instantly have to, if you feel a personal resentment, a personal sort of anger about it when you look at the characters involved. I mean, Kenneth Clarke famously was a director on of British Tobacco. I suspect he's not a poor individual who ever needs to use legal aid. And Grayling himself. I mean, both of these characters were involved in expenses fraud, expenses investigation, if I put it more carefully, when the expenses scandal came out. And Grayling himself has 4 homes, and he was claiming some money for a second home in Pimlico when he's an MP in Epsom, which is certainly within travelling distance of Parliament. And there are still questions over that in terms of an invoice that was claimed in the year after the work was done. It kept him within the amount that you could claim at that time. So there's a personal resentment, I feel, to these individuals, but there's a more important political argument. We live in the 7th richest country in the world. There are now a record number of billionaires, and there are 100 billionaires in the UK. 1% of the richest 1% earn the same as the 55 lowest percentage, the 55 the same wealth as the poorest 55%. And the idea that we can't afford legal aid and access to the court for the most vulnerable is a disgrace. And the final point on this is that there is a complete hypocrisy, because when the government need legal advice, they don't scrimp and save, they don't bear down on the cusp, they go to the most expensive people they can, and I'll give you the figures. James Eady QC, I don't know if he's here, but he earned 2.2 million from the government over the last 3 years, representing the government. And Jonathan Swift, QC, earned £1 million for 2 bits of advice. And he'll be happy man tonight. One of them was to do with the advice over what they should do about Parliament Square, protesters at Parliament Square. And the other, very important issue, of course, is what should be done about releasing information that had developed between Prince Charles and government ministers. So he was given a cool £1 million for that, and the reason he'll be happy is because there's one person protesting at Parliament tonight, I think he's still there, stood next to Winston Churchill up on the plinth with about 50 coppers around him, a complete waste of money. And I suspect they'll be going back to Jonathan Swift and spending a lot more money for his advice. Now, the other point I want to make, the general point, is what a time to be making these cuts. And I just want to make some wider points, really, just to sort of relate to legal aid. We've seen an extraordinary year and a half of enormous cases coming through of police malpractice, corruption, ineptitude that have had a massive effect on our society. And I picked the four most important there. The Coulson and Andy Coulson and Rebecca Brooks case. The reason this is all important to do with the police is because it reflects on their character. This is the sort of police we have in this society, and what sort of legal aid we have next to that is incredibly important. And hopefully it will develop through telling the story. But the Coulson Brooks case, what Cameron said when Andy Brooks, his mate, was convicted, was that this showed that no one's above the law. That's what he said. Now, the one thing you can say about that case is that it didn't show that. That is the one thing you can say with confidence, because what happened in that case was that in 2009, 8 files were sent to John Yates, who was the assistant commissioner at the time, and he spent one day looking at them, and he said, "There's nothing to answer here. There's no investigation to be done into the hacking story." And so they moved on until they were forced, through a fantastic campaign through the Guardian, to come back to the issue time and again. They kept sort of pushing it off until they were forced to take it seriously. Now we know, not thanks to John Yates or the police or anyone above the law, he took no interest in the fact that these serious people were involved in this issue. 3,000 people had their phones hacked, and we've had a series of people coming through the courts, police officers and officials, who were involved in all that scandal. But if the police had had that way, nothing would have happened at all. Andy Coulson would still be the director of Number 10. So that is the lesson that we learned from that. Now we come to the case of Stephen Lawrence. I mean, this is really the nadir of policing that Liz was mentioning earlier. Not only did the police skillfully manage not to investigate his racist murders, probably corruptly as well, actually, in terms of you look at the story carefully, but they ended up spying on the family for whom they were supposed to be finding justice. An extraordinary situation. Something called the Special Demonstration Squad ended up spying on that family. And what came out of that story was that the same squad had formed relationships with protesters, and not just relationships, and had children with protesters. An extraordinary scandal that has come about. And part of the reason I tell this story is that's come about is because of strong, professional, well-respected legal aid lawyers. Without the work of someone like Mike Schwartz, who got hold of the case of Mark Kennedy, who was an undercover officer involved in the animal rights campaign. And that came out of those cases that he ran. And since then, as well as campaigns, as well as the Lawrence campaign, as well as Alistair Morgan, a fantastic man, who's the brother of Daniel Morgan, but the work of Mike Schwartz and others brought out this whole story. We never would have known that what this squad was doing, the whole story of forming these relationships. And that has been pursued by people like Harry Wistrich, because they're still trying to hide behind the policy and neither confirm or deny that these officers had relationships with these women, which he's successfully challenged in the High Court. So the role that legal aid lawyers can hold the state to account and bring out the truth of corruption is essential. Unless we protect, and if we don't protect it, then these sort of things will go on. The third case I'll deal with briefly, Hillsborough. 23 years, we are told one story, and then now we know 100 police statements were amended, and now we know, even since the big investigation, the 50 statements were amended. And then part of that story is that mainly is the campaign, but also legal aid lawyers assisting them to get the inquest reopened, because it's a sort of difficult process, and assisting them now to get to the truth of what happened 23 years ago. And the last story there doesn't have that much to do with legal aid, but I do like the story. Is the story of Andrew Mitchell and his bike. This story is an extraordinary story of the extent that the police can go and can find themselves. And it really relates to the story of poor old Keith Wallace, who was in the diplomatic protection group in the Metropolitan Police. And he was the officer who said he was walking up Downing Street, up Whitehall, and saw what happened in Downing Street and corroborated the story to such an extent against Andrew Mitchell, a member of the Tory cabinet, that he wrote to his Tory MP to say, I saw what was going on and it was a disgrace, that sort of thing, and corroborated the story. And Andrew Mitchell resigned on the back of that. Unfortunately for poor old Keith Wallace, there was some CCTV that the Channel 4 pursued, and it showed that he wasn't, unfortunately, in Whitehall at all. And this was his police interview, which is the most enjoyable police interview I've ever read. It was a lie to say I was there. The truth is I was in Whitehall having a drink, and when I overheard colleagues talking about it the next day, I was so incensed I emailed my MP. I was incensed that he was not arrested. I was eventually 100% convinced I was there. Of course, in a roundabout way, I was backing up my colleagues, but I wasn't. It all exploded up. But sometime afterwards, I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, but I now know I wasn't. All I can say is that I'm really sorry, really sorry. I mean, my personal view is that if you believe that, you believe anything. The idea that he was just corroborating the story as a diplomatic officer without the involvement of any other police is too bizarre to believe. But anyway, he's now in prison on the back of that. And the point of telling that really is that this is the sort of thing that the police get up to on a big scale. But it reflects, if a member of the Tory cabinet could be fitted up in that way, just think about what's happening on our streets every day with the police. And it just brings me to the other broad theme, which is that the attack on legal aid has a devastating effect. We already are in a very dangerous position with the powers of the state against the individual. And you attack legal aid and you will further that so much, you take that so much further than it already is. There are a vast amount of laws, and it's possible that people sometimes, I got a call on Saturday from someone who was on a demo, and the police were saying he couldn't sell papers in the Royal Park. And sometimes people think that we're an anthology of the law, and we know, oh yes, that's the Royal Parks Act, 1997, I know that. No, so basically I end up in an argument with the Inspector on general principles, but there is a law for everything now. And one of the reasons for that is that the last government, which was the most reactionary government that has been, brought in a criminal law for every day it was in office. It was a terrible statistic. A criminal law for every day it was in office. They also introduced an ASBO for every day it's in office. So I'll just talk about that. That was the first law they brought in, was an ASBO, which is such a sweeping power where you can ban anything. If you think someone is behaving in a way likely to cause alarm, you can set up a banning order to ban them from doing anything at any time for the rest of their lives. And if they do that, they can face up to 5 years in prison. I mean, an extraordinary power that Jack Straw brought in there, which has proved to be completely ineffective in terms of dealing with wider social problems, but has ended up with lots of people just ending up in prison as repeat offenders. And they're sort of banning alcoholics from drinking, people with mental health problems and doing things that are obviously to do with their condition. The third thing that I put is the stop and search. Actually, I just on the ASBOs, I just wanted to say, because the person who used to promote that the most was Hazel Blair, who was a dreadful person who used to come every 4 months and say, we've got some more ASBOs, it's wonderful. And I was very, very pleased to see that she was caught up in the expenses raffle. £13,500 she overclaimed from the public purse. And she came on the telly and she said, she set it all up and she said, she'd written a cheque for £13,500. So I've written a cheque because I want people to like me. And I couldn't think of a figure that she could put on that cheque. The other example of how far the law went was the case of Brian Hall. So incensed on stopping Brian Hall that they brought in a law to ban people from being in Parliament Square, having tents in Parliament Square, or protests even, that weren't authorised 7 days in advance by the inspectors. And the wonderful thing about that law is the only person it didn't apply to was Brian Hall, because he was already there, so he didn't have to apply to the authority for something that when he was already there before the act came in. And just deal with stop and search, because there was a terrorism stop and search act that came in, 100,000 terrorism searches every year there were under section 44. Not a single person was arrested for terrorism or prosecuted for terrorism. It was a license to harass Asian youth by the police, and thankfully was thrown out on the challenge on liberty. But it's an example of the sort of powers that the police have and why we need a strong legal aid system to defend us from that. And the last area on that list is the prosecution. And I'm just going to give you an example of some cases I've worked on, just to show you how legal aid can make a difference. In 2009, January 2009, there were very big protests in London against the killing of 500 people in Gaza, while the world watched on and did absolutely nothing. Enormous protests, wonderful protests of protests there. The police, at the end, there was the Israeli embassy, and there was some altercation, if I can put it in broad terms. It wasn't that dramatic, actually. But the police decided to prosecute 10 months later 100 people, 100 youth, and 70 with something called violent disorder, which is the second most serious charge you can face under the Public Order Act. And if you're charged with that, you are going to prison pretty much. It's very, very difficult to avoid going to prison. The way they dealt with people, it just contrasts with the way they dealt with Alan Coulson, who went to his house and invited him down to the station, and the evidence somehow, the evidence disappeared. With these young people, they smashed down their door and take them down to the police station, and they were all dealt with about 50 different lawyers. Nobody knew what they were doing. Everybody went to the first appearance, and virtually everybody pleaded guilty. About 63 of them pleaded guilty at the first appearance, and 62 of them went to prison on the back of the way the police operated against those protesters. Virtually all of them were Muslim, and virtually all of them were of good character. And most of them were young students who were looking at the cusp of their life, but were just angry about what was happening in Gaza and no one was doing anything about it. That's the way they were treated by the police. And just contrast what happened to them to what happened in the student protests in terms of who got better representation. The same thing happened in the student protest. Exactly the same thing happened. 100 people were charged, 70 with violent disorder, the second most serious offence, you go to prison. This time there was a campaign that got in early, and they were directed to lawyers who knew what they were doing and protected them to some extent, and virtually nobody pleaded guilty at the first appearance. There was massive pressure then on the prosecution. They brought all these cases on this big vague law that's easy to prove, but actually very difficult to defend. But everybody says we're fighting it. And it ended up with only 12 people going to prison. There's a massive difference, not just in cost, cost of prison costs or whatever, but the human lives. All these people, young students of good character, and now can go through life without the ordeal of having been to prison and a conviction over them. And all of them, same justification, angry in the process of fees being brought in when the Lib Dems promised that they would do no such thing. So that's the importance of strong legal aid proper practices. And if Grady has his way, we will all be in the Gaza column. And if we have our way, we will be able to protect people in the future. I'll just finish on the last 5-10 minutes on the battle for legal aid, and there's just a few pictures of what we've achieved over the last year. I think I'm very proud actually of the number of things that lawyers have done over the last year. I didn't actually think that we would ever get to the stage of doing some of the things that we did. Legal aid lawyers are generally busy, tired, and individualised. And we've come together. The first thing we did is we organised within our organisations, and it really started, I do some of it with the Haldane Society, coming together, having a debate. What can we do? Nice discussion, and sort of deciding on a set of activities, deciding on an argument that we had to fight and we had to strike, really, is what was put there first time back in April last year. The LCCSA, London Criminal Solicitors, and the CLSA getting organised. But as Liz said earlier, public protest, putting the argument, the first person you can see there is Jerry Conlon, who very sadly died a few months ago. But he came over from Belfast, and he put the argument against Eddie Stobart, the best argument anybody could put, which was that, we might need Eddie Stobart if we have him, because they'll need the lorries to take the innocent people to the Court of Appeal on miscarriages. He represented, along with Rita Power from the Birmingham Six, famous miscarriages cases, knew what this was about. That will have a return of those cases of bad representation, but also it will take away the lawyers who helped to resolve those cases, because they just won't exist. The other thing we managed to do was to expose the Lib Dems, who have an official policy of staying the legal aid cuts, but have gone along with every single legal aid cut. And it is quite a scandalous position, where at their conference last year they voted unanimously to stay the cuts, and the leadership have just ignored that. But it got worse than that. On the second picture there, we delivered a letter signed by 100 organisations from around the country. And Simon Hughes received the letter, and he said, I agree with you, really. You're right, but I'm not part of the government. The only problem with his argument was about 3 months later, he was part of the government. He went into the Ministry of Justice and then said, it's too late, all the cuts have come in. And they are exposed, I think, forever, as to that they have not stood up for the most vulnerable in society on this area and other areas. I think the proudest thing, though, is that lawyers, for the first time in history, not only had a half-day strike, but a full-day strike in March last year. An extraordinary achievement. I mean, so many people said, oh, it'll never happen, we can't do it. And we did it, and we weren't unpopular. We even made it to the front page of the Guardian, and very pleased people were to see us taking a stand, and we got wonderful support there. And I think it helped us win some of the things that we've won. Sadly, since then, we've learned that the bar have, to some extent, sold us out and taken a separate deal, which I think undermines the unity that we need. But a third of the bar voted against that, and I'm convinced that we can do a lot in the future. Just in terms of what we need to do, I mean, for people here, I've got postcards with the Justice Alliance thing. You'll see Stephen Fry there. He's part of a film that we put together of real cases defending legal aid. And I encourage people to come and take the postcards, get them round, sign the petition, get it round social media. But I think the other thing we'll need to do is that in February this year starts the celebrations of Magna Carta. The extraordinary position of the government saying, oh, how wonderful Magna Carta, and they've done everything they can to undermine the contents of the Magna Carta. But in February those celebrations start, and we'll be looking to unite with our other organisations within Justice Alliance and APO, all the professional organisations, to have one day. I think we need a Justice Day, where we come out and celebrate Magna Carta and attack this government for all that they're trying to do. Thank you very much.